So this is a complete comparison between the Garmin Forerunner 970, the Garmin Venu X1, and the Garmin Fenix 8. All three of these watches are incredibly similar, yet very different. And I've been putting them through all sorts of crazy adventures over the last while, including hikes deep into the Alps, crazy rides in the mountains, as well as open water swimming and plenty more. And that's all backstopped by roughly a year of experience on the Garmin Fenix 8, roughly 3 months on the Forerunner 970, and a couple months on the Venu X1. And I've spent an absurd amount of time creating this giant Excel workbook tracking more than 230 different items between these watches to figure this all out. And note that this video is sponsored by Precision Fuel and Hydration. More about them a little bit later on in the video. So the very first thing to know here is the price. They are organized on the table here by price: $749 US for the Forerunner 970, $799 for the Venu X1, and starting at $999 for the Garmin Fenix 8. Now, you'll notice I am comparing the AMOLED models here. There is additionally the MIP-based or solar-enabled models for the Fenix 8. They cost a bit more. I'm not going to compare those here too much other than briefly mentioning them in the battery department. Otherwise, they have all the exact same features. So with the price out of the way, let's look at the cases themselves. The Forerunner 970 is 47 millimeters, the Venu X1 is 46 millimeters, and the Fenix 8 comes in 3 sizes: a 43 millimeter, a 47 millimeter, and a larger 51 millimeter. In this case right here, you see the medium size, the 47 millimeter one. That's the one I prefer to wear. From a display size perspective, both the Forerunner 970 as well as the middle-sized Fenix 8 have the exact same 1.4-inch AMOLED display, versus the Venu X1 has a gigantic 2-inch AMOLED display. It is gigantic, though again, in wearing it the last 2 months, you kind of get used to it. Like at first, the very first day, it was like, whoa, that's a bit crazy. But honestly, it just feels normal now. However, the single biggest difference from a display standpoint is not the size here, but the display brightness. In the case of the Fenix 8, it features Garmin's basically previous gen AMOLED display from a brightness standpoint. Garmin doesn't disclose the nit values, the brightness values of any of their watches, but it's largely agreed upon that the Fenix 8 is a 1000 nit display. However, the Forerunner 970 and the Venu X1 have much brighter displays. The assumption here is that between 1500 and 2000 nits, if even brighter than that. And at first thought, you may be like, oh, brighter is better, right? Yeah, kind of. I live on a warm, like Mediterranean sunny island. I have no problem seeing the display of the Fenix 8 or any other 1000 nit display in any conditions, period. Like that's just a solved thing. The downside with these brighter displays is that the way Garmin has them configured today, they burn a ton more battery, an absolute crap ton more battery. And I'll talk about that more in the battery section later on, but just keep that in mind as we go forward. Oh, hey, and just a quick note, if you're finding this video interesting and useful, just simply watch it all the way through. That is the only thing the YouTube ads care about these days, and it really does help with this video and the channel quite a bit. The next hardware thing to keep in mind is the actual band itself. So if we flip these over real quick here, the Venu X1 comes with this fabric-y strap right there. I like it. However, you'll also notice in the case of the Fenix 8, it has Garmin's quick fit system. This allows you to very quickly just simply pop off the band like this and put it back on again. Whereas the Forerunner 970 has one of their older style bands that isn't so quick to pop on and off. You can buy quick fit bands for this watch if you'd like to, though. That is extra. But you cannot buy their so-called quick fit brands for the Venu X1, but it does have a standard watch attachment there, watch band attachment. So you can easily just pop it off like this, and you can kind of wiggle it back on again without too much difficulty at all. Now I'm actually going to leave the band off for a second just to make this next bit a little bit easier, which is the optical heart rate sensor. All three of these watches do have the same Garmin Gen 5 optical heart rate sensor. That's Garmin's latest and greatest optical heart rate sensor with skin temperature readings and does better like with intervals and stuff like that. However, the Venu X1 does not have ECG support, and that's for a couple reasons. Number one being that there is no metal bezel on the front of the watch. So normally you put the watch on, you touch the metal bezel like this, and it completes the circuit when you do an ECG. In this case, there is no metal bezel to do that. Now, they could have used the button up here like they do on the older Venu 2 Plus, but to do that, Garmin would have to make the watch case thicker. And the main thing about the Venu X1 is it's designed to be an incredibly thin watch. It is Garmin's thinnest watch to date ever from a GPS watch standpoint, and that was some of the sacrifices they made by not having ECG. Here's what the depth of each one of those watches look like, as well as the weight. Keeping in mind that the Fenix 8 has a gazillion different options of of bezel materials and band materials and sizes, so that gets really complex really quickly. Now, the next piece to know here on the hardware side is that all three of these do have flashlights on the front there. So I can go ahead and double tap in the case of the Forerunner 970 and Fenix 8, and then long hold in the case of the Venu X1. And you can see the flashlight control along the left-hand side there of both of these watches. One thing that's worthwhile noting is in the case of both the Forerunner and the Fenix, they actually do have two separate LED white lights there. And then in the middle there is a red LED light that you can change to. Versus the Venu X1 only has one white light and one red light. Now, practically speaking, you would be hard-pressed to notice the difference. In the real world, is simply a non-event, but I figured I at least would mention it. However, one thing that is really different is the speaker. In the case of the Fenix 8, that was one of the first watches they had after the Venu 3 to include a speaker, and it includes what I presume to be Garmin's like first-gen speaker in it. However, the Forerunner 970 definitely increases that speaker volume, and then the Venu X1 substantially increases the speaker volume.
Hello, this is the test of a microphone from about 1 foot away. Hello, this is the test of a microphone from about 1 foot away. Hello, this is the test of a microphone from about 1 foot away.
Okay, so with that, we're going to leave all the hardware differences behind. Here's a nifty chart I made of all those hardware differences. Okay, so the next piece here is sort of the daily software side of things. Now, in this case, one of the biggest benefits of these three watches is that they are all now finally on the exact same code base. There is, however, a slight difference in the styling, and you can see that right here in the widgets. If you look at the styling of the Forerunner 970 and the Fenix 8, they're relatively similar, except the UI styling in the case of the Forerunner 970 has different slashes and different icons. The icons are a bit bigger, versus the Venu X1 in the middle here has more of like a bubbly sort of, look to it. Versus over here on the Fenix 8, it's a little more industrial or whatever you want to call it. In talking to Garmin, they say that the different product groups target different customers. Those different customers like different schemes, I guess. But the good news is that that is just like a skin on top of the underlying code. The important thing here is that every single one of the daily features is identical. Things like the brand new evening report, which mirrors the morning report we had from a couple years ago, but now in the evening with sort of a summary of your day and what's coming up tomorrow. That's the same on all watches, just again with slight user interface tweaks. However, because of the fact that these watches have different buttons, there are cases where you will interact with those features differently. In the case of the Forerunner 970 and of the Fenix 8, they have Garmin's 5-button layout. You can see right there are 3 buttons on the left-hand side and 2 buttons on the right-hand side, plus of course the touchscreen display that you can go through the different menus. But the Venu X1 only has 2 buttons right there. On the right side, you can see do not update right now. Don't get excited. Nope, nope, nope. I said, okay, nope, nope. Okay, fine, later, nope. Versus the Venu X1 only has 2 buttons right there. So you have some things like starting and stopping an activity where you can use this upper right-hand button to open up the menu and start and stop, or the lower right-hand button to do laps. But other things will require the touchscreen to get through where you could have used buttons in the past. For example, back here, you can't go through the widgets without using the touchscreen. Versus over here, I can go through the widgets by just using the lower left-hand button right there to go all the way through. Now, of course, if you're buying this kind of watch, you're buying it for sports usage. And you're going to access all of your sport modes by pressing the upper right-hand button just like this, like that. There you go. This opens up the sport menus. And then from there, you can see a gazillion more sports under the activities list. You can customize these how you see fit. You can pin them, etc. Which then gets the question of how are the sport modes different. So to begin with, all 3 of these watches have this base set of sport modes that you see right there on the screen. However, some of the watches have other sport modes as well. Typically in the case of the Fenix 8, because it has a higher waterproof rating, 100 meters versus 50 meters for these 2 right here, that means Garmin deems it worthy of some extra higher speed water sports. Though it should be noted the Forerunner 970 does have the sail race mode, but the Venu X1 doesn't for some odd reason. Now, of course, in addition to those surface water modes, there are also diving modes on the Fenix 8 because it has a depth sensor. So that is one hardware difference that these other 2 do not have. This has a full depth sensor down to 45 meters. You can use it for scuba diving or free diving down to 45 meters. It'll track all your scuba metrics as well. I dive into that, no pun intended, in my full Fenix 8 review up in the corner there. But if you do scuba dive recreationally, this will pretty much cover the vast majority of what you would need. But of course, sport modes on Garmin are always Quirks. Forerunner 970 doesn't have gaming, but the other 2 watches do. Why are these not the same? Also, I told you like 3 times in the last 5 minutes to install the update later. Now, The other area where things are different is golfing. The most notable and obvious feature that the 970 is lacking compared to those two is the full vector map. So you can see that right here, where the 970 just shows the hole versus the Venu X1 and the Fenix 8 show basically everything around the hole. In addition, there's other features that are missing, like the virtual caddy, plays alike, and wind speed, as well as a few others that you can see in this giant chart I put together as well. I will admit that I'm not really a small ball, like small golf ball kind of person, but I'm sure there's probably more nuanced differences beyond that, but that's like the gist of things. Next, we get to other mapping and navigational features, and this is probably the biggest change for the past between these three product lines. They're the same. For the first time ever, they are identical. Every single setting I could find, down to the deepest possible setting, was identical across all three watches. All the maps, all the navigation, all the crazy little features that Garmin has in their Fenix lineup are now identical in all three of these watches. Again, thanks to that shared code base. And this includes all the new sport features launched on both the Forerunner 970 as well as the Venu X1 are now available on the Fenix 8 in public beta and in the next couple weeks in production as well. This means, to be clear, that all three watches have free, global, Topoactive downloadable maps that you can download onto the watch, and they all have 32 gigs of storage, which is basically more than enough for about 2 continents worth of maps. And of course, one of the things that's super important when you're doing one of these super long treks, whether it be 4, 6, 12, 16 hours in one shot, or many, many days in a row, is having the proper fueling and nutrition to pull that off. And for that, over the last few years, I've been using precision fuel and hydration as my primary method of getting fuel during those rides and runs and hikes and all my crazy adventures, as has my wife during all of her training as well. And of course, you're also going to see at both the men's and the women's Tour de France teams, Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, etc. And one of the cool things about precision fuel and hydration is when it comes to race day or planning for race day or planning for your training, you can actually call up one of their sports scientists, have a 20-minute free Zoom call to figure out what the best products are to fuel your particular event. I've done that for both racing of things like triathlon events, as well as my multi-day hike across the island of Madeira, where I was trying to balance the amount of gels and fueling products I would carry with what I would get along the way as just real food. Because if you're doing a multi-day trek, you're probably gonna have to find some sort of balance there. And one of the things that's super important is ensuring both the gels as well as any hydration products you take is actually edible after like 10, 12, 14 hours straight of taking it. And I haven't had any problems in doing so. Unlike the Fenix 8 here, which is having problems, install later. Now, all of their products are Informed Sport certified, all are vegan, all are 2-to-1 glucose fructose, and contain no artificial ingredients. You can visit the link in the description for the free fuel and hydration planner, or save 15% off your first order with the coupon code you see on the screen right there. Thanks again to Precision Fuel and Hydration for sponsoring this video. Next, let's start diving into the battery pieces here. And the first thing to probably mention is some of the power managing modes that are on these watches. In the case of the Forerunner 970 and the Fenix 8, they are identical. They have both battery saver as well as activity power modes where you can create these customized modes if you want to, so you can disable certain features and so on. Versus the Venu X1 doesn't have that. They have a basic battery saver mode that will essentially turn off a bunch of stuff and save you a bunch of battery life, primarily for smartwatch usage. Really, no, trust me, later. Later is like really later, not like 5 minutes from now. And at first glance, I thought that was weird, but then when you realize how bad the battery is on the Venu X1, Garmin probably just looked at it and was like, why bother? It's not gonna make a difference. So let's talk about battery life. So starting off on the smartwatch side of things, here is the official battery chart of these three watches, as Garmin claims. Now, as with all AMOLED display watches, you have effectively 2 modes for the display, always on or gesture based. Always on is what I use, which means that when I watch this down like this, it'll dim the watch state, raise my wrist up, it goes to full brightness. Gesture based means that when my wrist is down like this, it turns off the display, and I raise it up, it turns back on the display at full brightness. This means that my wrist is like this, I can't see the time there, and I don't really like that, so I use always on. Now, in the case of the Fenix 8, the always on real world time for me and my workouts of roughly doing like 1 to 2, 1 to 3 hours of GPS time per day ends up being like 4.5 to 6 days before I have to charge the battery again. That's good for me. However, in the case of Forerunner 970, I've been getting like 2.5 to 3 days, maybe 3.5 days if I was lucky. And the kicker is I turned down like all of the brightness settings below the defaults, versus in the case of the Fenix 8, I could leave them at the default brightness settings. Now, in the case of the Venu X1, that's even worse. Officially, it's claimed at 2 days. I would say that is optimistic at best. And the thing to understand is that Garmin has basically 3 brightness levels on their watches. You can see them right here being displayed. So in this case, the Fenix 8, I have it at default at 2/3 brightness. And then over here, these 2 newer watches, I have it at 1/3 brightness. The absolute lowest you can go. You can't go any lighter than that. But when you go up to the next level there, it is brighter for sure. And obviously way brighter when you go all the way to full brightness. In the case there, I can go brighter as well. I've had no problems with the 2/3 brightness or even the 1/3 brightness on the Fenix 8. These watches, as you can see by the camera being blown out from the exposure standpoint, is just so absurdly bright there. And as a result, it burns way more battery than it ever should. Garmin really needs to add some sort of like quarter or, I don't know, 5th level brightness option here to bring these brightness levels down and get me more battery life back. Because when I do reduce these brightness levels down, you can see an impact on battery life, especially in the case of the Forerunner 970, where I'm able to get battery life during GPS activities much closer to the Fenix 8 in certain scenarios. So as an example of that, I'm going to quickly show you 3 different battery charts. Again, I am not updating right now. Anyways, as I was saying, first battery chart was from a hike this past Friday, 7 hours or something like that. And you can see there that at the end of that hike, I was down to 6% battery life on the Venu X1. So virtually nothing left at this point. So in the case of the Fenix and Forerunner, I was floating between 70 and 80% battery remaining. And you can see the estimated total hours of battery that I would have had for that particular activity. The next day, I went out for about a 4-hour or so trail run. And you can see there, relatively similar overall battery estimations at the bottom there. And keeping in mind, I was doing my darndest to keep off of the map display field while I was navigating. I was mostly on the Climb Pro page as opposed to the map page. Once you're on the map page, you can see those crazy drops right there. That is when it's on the map page because it like defaults back to that occasionally in certain scenarios. And I have to catch it and change it. And you can see it just burns through battery like nobody's business. Now, we should note that in the case of both of those 2 hikes this past weekend, I had these Fenix and Forerunner watches on my backpack versus the other one was on my wrist. They were just bouncing around and all 3 watches were connected to a chest heart rate strap. But I also did a hike in the Canadian Rockies with all 3 watches on my hands and wrists. So they're all getting like equal display activation time and effectively the exact same overall battery burn capacity, roughly 30 hours of battery life for the Fenix and the Forerunner, and again, roughly 10-11 hours for the Venu X1, which seems like a good time then to talk about GPS accuracy. Now, both the Forerunner and the Fenix units have multi-band or dual frequency GPS, but the Venu X1 doesn't. However, before you worry too much, one of the things I've said consistently for years is I do not care how a watch gets accurate GPS signals and plots accurate GPS tracks. It doesn't matter to me, just get the job done. That's all I care about. The thing is, even in super hard scenarios, there's almost no difference between these watches. You can see in these crazy switchbacks I was going up in the Alps this past weekend, the tracks are virtually the same across all these watches. So just no meaningful difference there that I would worry about. About the only difference I've seen is some lackluster performance from the Forerunner 970 in open water swimming, but that's the only scenario where I've seen differences there, and it hasn't been horrible, but it hasn't been like as perfect as the other 2. Otherwise, GPS across the board is great from an accuracy standpoint. So then let's go ahead and wrap up the accuracy section on the heart rate side of things. That is identical best I can see across all of my workouts and activities. Okay, so let's kind of wrap things up and give you my final recommendations and thoughts. All 3 of these watches here are, of course, very, very good watches. I think the core factor here for most people is going to be the size and style design that you want of the watch, and then frankly, battery life. It's going to be battery life, battery life, battery life. That is going to be probably your biggest driving factor between these 3 watches. And the second biggest one likely being the buttons and whether you want more buttons or don't really care about additional buttons. Of course, there are other differences beyond that, like for example, diving. If you want that, well, you're kind of going to have to go with the Fenix 8 there because the other 2 don't really have that. For me personally, I'm going to eventually end up back on the Fenix 8. And there's really 2 core reasons for that. Number 1 is, as you might expect, battery life. I'm just tired of charging my watch every other day with the Venu X1 and the Forerunner 970 not too far behind that. And then number 2 being buttons. I just like more buttons. I like being able to quickly go down through the widgets like this and just getting to the buttons and being there and done with it. That's just, again, my personal preference. As a general rule of thumb, I like lighter watches, and I probably would be on the Forerunner 970 if the battery life wasn't as bad as it is right now. So maybe if they fix that through more display settings, I would end up back on that battery life. Oh, it thought about wanting to update again. It offered the update again. It's like, no, I didn't mean it. Maybe it's finally listening. But ultimately, those are just my personal preferences, and yours will probably differ for what you want and what you prioritize. Thanks again for watching this video. I really appreciate it, and have a good one.